Hello everyone. Today we talk about dictators. Why dictator favor war and its connection to the China anti-Japan hate education and the anti-Taiwan independence propaganda education throughout the history. Dictators have shown a proclivity for waging war, whether through ancient imperial conquest or modern territorial disputes. War often serves as a tool to consolidate power and divert attention from domestic issues. From Hitler's expansionism to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, authoritarian regimes frequently use conflict to achieve internal and external objectives. Similarly, the Chinese government employs anti-Japan hate education and anti-Taiwan independence propaganda stoke nationalism, favor, and construct external enemies. While not directly tied to war, these strategies share the same underlying logic as dictators' warmongering. This explores why dictators favor war and examine the true motives behind the China's anti-Japan education and anti-Taiwan independence campaign. Why dictators favor war consolidate domestic power. Dictators face the constant challenge of maintaining absolute control, and war is an effective means to unify the populace and deflate internal discontent. During economic downturns, social unrest, or political crisis, dictators often fabricate external threats to shift public focus. For instance, Nazi Germany's Hitler's used invasion of neighboring countries to blame economic woes on external enemies, thereby strengthening his regime. War not only ignites nationalism favor but also provides a pretext for tighter social control, such as curbing free speech or suppressing dissent. Creating external enemies, dictatorial regimes often requires an enemy to bolster their legitimacy. By attributing domestic failure to external forces, rulers obscure their own governance shortcomings. Propaganda portraying the nation as an underside fosters fear and loyalty among citizens, reinforcing support for the regime. For example, North Korea's Kim dynasty has long depicted the United States and South Korea as an existential threat to maintain domestic unity and veneration of its leader. War, or the spectre of it, serves as a tool to manipulate public sentiment, diverting attention from internal injustice or corruption. Economic and resource gain war also offer dictators opportunity for economic gain and resource acquisition. Historically, authoritarian regimes have invaded territories to seize land, resource, or wealth to offset domestic economic deficiency. For instance, Saddam Hussein's 1990 invasion of Kuwait was partly motivated by a desire to control its vast oil reserve. Additionally, war can stimulate the military-industrial complex, generating profit for interest groups tied to the regime, further entrenching the dictator's power. Personal ambitions and historical legacy. Dictators often harbor grandiose ambitions, seeking to leave a great mark on the history through war. They may view themselves as a nation's savior or executor of the historical mission. For example, Mussolini aimed to revive the Roman Empire through the invasion of Ethiopia. War provide a stage for dictators to showcase power and expand influence, feeding their inflated egos. The true motives behind the China anti-Japan education and the anti-Taiwan propaganda. Anti-Japan education, creating an enemy to deflect tension through textbooks, films, and commemorative events. Its Chinese governments emphasized Japan's wartime atrocities during World War II, fostering anti-Japan sentiment. While remembering history is important, its education often deliberately inflamed nationalism, portraying Japan as a perpetual enemy. For instance, school curricula draw on events like Nanjing Massacre, but rarely mention post-war improvement in Sino-Japanese relationship of Japan's peaceful development. This selective narrative aims to provoke anger and dependence on the government. This tactic aligns with the dictator's war-mongering logic, use external enemies to divert domestic tensions. China faced challenges like wealth inequality, environmental pollution, and corruption, fueling public discontent. Anti-Japan education served as a safety valve, channeling public frustration outward and masking governance failure. It also provides popular support for the government's hardline stance against Japan in diplomacy, enhancing regime legitimacy. Anti-Taiwan independence propaganda consolidate power through nationalism. The Chinese government viewed Taiwan as a core issue, using anti-Taiwan independence propaganda to frame reunification as essential to national rejuvenation. State media frequently depict Taiwan independence force as a threat to national unity, portraying Taiwan's tie with the Western nations, such as the U.S., as a provocation against Chinese sovereignty. This rhetoric not only stoke nationalism, but also create opposition in independence with prejudice. The true motive behind the propaganda mirrors why dictators wage war, creating external threats to strengthen domestic control. Taiwan as a democratic society with a free election and civil liberty starkly contrasts with the mainland China's authoritarian systems. This contrast could inspire demands for democracy among mainland citizens, threatening the CCP's rule. By demonizing Taiwan's independence, the government casts Taiwan as a separatist enemy, suppressing domestic discussion about democratic reforms. Additionally, the propaganda justifies an assertive international stance, boasting domestic authority. War threats as a control mechanism, while China has not directly waged war against Japan or Taiwan. Its military modernization, frequent exercise, and threat in the Taiwan Strait reflect the same logic as dictators' use of war threats. By flexing military muscle, the government intimidates external adversary while fostering a national security first atmosphere at home, justifying a stricter social control. For instance, after the Pelosi 2022 visit to Taiwan, China conducted large-scale military drills in the Taiwan Strait, signaling resolve to both Taiwan and domestic audience. Conclusion: dictators favor war to consolidate power, deflect tension, seize resource, and fulfill personal ambition. China and anti-Japan hate education and anti-Taiwan independence propagandas, while not direct precursor to war, share the same logic, using external enemies to develop domestic discontent and bolster regime legitimacy. But portraying Japan and Taiwan's independence force as a threat, the government feel nationalism and mass governor shortcoming. However, this approach risks diplomatic isolation or unintended escalation. For true stability and prosperity, China must address internal governance issues and foster an open, inclusive society rather than relying on external spectacles. Thank you so much.